Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Deanna Minich. Welcome to this webinar. The title is The Rainbow Diet, How to Nourish Your Whole Self with Color. And I'm letting you know now that it's going to be a little bit of a different type of presentation. I'm definitely going to get into the science of colorful food, but I'm also going to bring in some of the emotional, mental, and perhaps even spiritual aspects of color and creativity. And I do think that if you're a health practitioner of some type, a nutritional therapist, a health coach, that this information may actually inspire you and infuse your practice. It will hopefully infuse your life and have a ripple effect into the lives of your clients. So let's get started. Truly, I do believe that all of us have a story. We each have a timeline of our existence when things happened. And often in functional medicine, we focus on that story. We focus on when things happen, the point of origin, what was the root cause of the symptoms that we have in the present day. So when I think back to my particular story, I have a strong one as it relates to food and eating. And we actually all have mini stories within the larger macro story. And if you just were to look at your story with food and eating, I'm sure you would find some very interesting tidbits. You know, I've believed and found that how we eat is truly how we live, and how we live is how we eat. And so much of our eating experience defines us. Our relationship to food defines our relationship with ourselves. So that's why I like to have clients focus in on their story as it relates to food and eating specifically. And for me personally, I've had a number of different things that have happened, just like we all have. So some of the messages that I had about food when I was growing up is that eating was about being serious. I had rather strict parents, and so there was no laughing at the dinner table. We weren't allowed to have sweets. My mother was a self-proclaimed health nut, and she was really, I would say, cutting edge for her time. You know, me growing up in the 1970s, there wasn't the same consciousness about food and eating like there is now. That said, there were still many rules and regimens that were implemented at home. So we had to eat everything on our plates. It was almost like the plate was the bullseye, the target. And when I would go to social functions, I wasn't able to eat foods that everyone else would eat. So if I would go to a scout outing or a birthday party, I was told to be very vigilant and not to be eating and partaking in a lot of those festivities. So I do think that in some way, all of these events led to me having this sense of restriction in my life and having that emotional restriction as well. And that led to certain physical manifestations like binging, a lot of emotional eating. I would overeat, and all the while, especially during my teen years, I just felt different. I think most teenagers do, but I felt different through my experience of food. And one other piece that I'd like to bring in here is that my parents, especially my mother, also had this revelation around faith. So not only was I different in our food practices at home, but also in faith. And so my mother was very stringent in our eating, and she was also very stringent about our believing. So these two things, food and faith, really set the tone for me early on. And so as I progressed into my 20s, I had developed some health conditions. In fact, those actually started when I was even a teenager. So when I was a teenager, I would have very severe premenstrual syndrome, to the point that oftentimes it would require medication. I would, on a monthly basis, I would be so debilitated. There might have been vomiting, being doubled over in lots of pain, and really opting out of a lot of the social activities with my peers. Separate from that, I also developed some gut issues. I had irritable bowel syndrome. I also had acne. I decided that I was going to take Accutane for the acne that I had. And now looking back, I can see that everything was amazingly interrelated. Of course, right? Reproductive system connecting into the gut, connecting right there into the skin. And now at the age of my late 40s, almost 48, I can clearly see that that was the case. But at the time, it was almost like I was being swallowed up. And this affected my psyche. It created bouts of depression, anxiety, despair. And I decided to study science because I felt like I have to figure this out. But I was only able to go so far with science. I remember I had finished my master's degree. I was in the throes of my PhD, and I felt very, I would say I hit my low point, one of my low points during my PhD, where I felt very isolated, very lonely. I was spending lots of time in the lab. I didn't have much social interaction except for sometimes some other students that were working late night at the lab. And I remember one of those weekends that I came back, and I hadn't really done this before, but I bought a huge piece of paper and I began painting with really bright colors. And to me, I didn't feel like using any watercolors or muted colors or even pastels. I wanted the most vivid, hyper-saturated colors possible, like almost a surreal, hyper-real color that was before me to almost blind me from what seemed like my very gray existence. And so that began my painting journey. I'm not a trained painter, I'm not a trained professional in the arts of any type. What I've come to know, however, is that we are all artists. We all have the force of creative expression within us. And when that creative expression is stuffed, quelled, and silenced, I do think we can see issues. And that could even be through our general expression of who we are. If we're not expressing who we are and feeling free and authentic in that realm, I do think that we can start to see a number of different issues. I've seen it with others, and I clearly saw it in myself. So in my 30s, I got on another painting spree. And it was interesting because I was very much into nutrition at the time. This is when I really had my revelation in functional medicine. Goodness, I was teaching health professionals. I did a whole lecture circuit on women's health for one whole year. And all that while, I was there continuing to suffer with not only endometriosis to some degree, but also with a blocked fallopian tube. This is called a hydrosalpinx. So my left fallopian tube had become scarred and closed off because of the adhesions and inflammation from endometriosis over all these years. And essentially it started to fill with fluid, and it was causing me some subtle pain and pressure in my low left abdomen. So I needed to get that checked out every year. And it was this moment when I was painting. I never tried to sit down and make sense of my paintings, but it was one night I was painting, and my husband leans over and he's looking at what I'm painting. And it was a painting like the one you're seeing on the screen. And he said to me, "Deanna, I think you're painting your ovaries and your uterus over and over again." And it was one of those aha moments where all of a sudden I began to see that, yes, perhaps my body is actually trying to express herself. And so after that revelation, I began painting fast and furious. I began doing all of these different paintings of my ovaries and uterus. And it was a pretty intense period in my life. And this picture that you see of me here is when I decided to showcase all of these paintings in a small art gallery run by a friend. So I put these paintings out there to the world. I had no shame, no fear, and I wasn't even invested in whether or not people like them. To me, I just had to get this side of myself out. I needed to express who I was fully. without any type of pretense. After I had this gallery showing, I was due back at my doctor's office in order to get an ultrasound. I was getting annual ultrasounds. And after this flurry of painting and going through this whole process, essentially after being scanned that year, there was no trace of the blocked fallopian tube anymore. And according to my gynecologist, my uterus looked beautiful. So that was a turning point for me. That happened about 5 years ago now. And I had this other wake-up call, which is, wow, here I've been studying color through foods, through my PhD, through my master's study of nutrition, and I'm tapping into color in my life. And who knows, I think I might have just healed myself through this creative process by expressing who I really am. And so I began to thread the pieces together into a larger tapestry of what I would consider a number of different, seemingly disparate topics, but all really coming into one. That would include creativity, color, food, eating, and living. And so now my new mantra is that by living a colorful life, we really do find another spirit of healing. If we eat colorfully, we live colorfully. If we live colorfully, we eat colorfully. Once we're tuned in, tapped into color, it's almost like we can't see anything but color. So that was a long-winded explanation into my story, but I feel like it's important because it does help set the framework as to why a PhD scientist would go down a nonlinear path, a circuitous route of bringing in and folding in things like painting and personal growth and various creative expressions. Why did I ever bring that into my work, and why is it so important? As part of my path, I was also studying the yogic principles. I started my yoga journey when I was 19 years old. That was when I went away to college and I felt the first sense of freedom. So I took my first class at 19, and I realized that in conjunction with all of my science classes that there was this whole aspect of ancient traditions, this whole aspect of spirituality that was rooted in something very old, in the Vedic tradition, in Ayurveda, in the yogic tradition. And they had this system of chakras, chakra meaning a spinning wheel, lots of activity. It's a Sanskrit word. And so these chakras being placed at certain parts of the body where there's lots of activity. Now, through my science eyes, what I was seeing is that these places of lots of activity are actually our endocrine system. So perhaps what the ancients were intending is some connection here, now with my modern eyes, to what I would call the psycho-neuro-immune endocrine system, the points of interconnection in our bodies. So this had inspired me. This brought me along throughout my journey and in parallel with a lot of my scientific work. And I began to see patterns. I began to see that there were certain clusters of not just physiological systems, but also how those coupled to psychological and mental emotional realms. And so for each of these 7 systems, there is a color, and it correlates to some part of the body, locationally, distributionally. We'll talk more about that. So already there was this intermingling of the East and the West and the science and the spirit. I just hadn't put it all together until I had my own journey with color. So now I talk about the 7 systems of health is what I call them, because I believe that I've taken this beyond the chakras and started to bring in things like functional medicine, brought in things like integrative medicine, brought in my own system of seeing different patterns, pattern recognition of food and lifestyle. So each of these 7 colors represents a larger system or web represents the body aspects, the lifestyle, and then nutrition. One of the things that I hear from a number of practitioners, and I just heard it again today, is that it's very difficult for people to figure out how to thread together all of the pieces. So when you're meeting with a client, how do you bring together a talk about nutrition, and then maybe how are they feeling nourished in their lives? How do you actually go back and forth? How do you straddle them both? And so I began to use the 7 Systems of Health model as my operating system. Here is a more fleshed out map of the different systems, the anatomy, the physiology, the core issues, the balanced lifestyle, and the foods. So this is the navigation map. And so what I'm going to do in this presentation is take you through each one. We're going to go color by color, and I'm going to unpack each of the colors and really hone in on the food pieces. I mean, we could have another presentation where I'm just focused on the lifestyle pieces. I'll touch on that a bit, but really the focus of this webinar is to go a bit deeper into the food aspect, the final and last column here. So I am not a dietary dogma person. I was just talking with somebody today about the ketogenic diet, and it seems like every day there's a new diet that's cropping up in its popularity. And to me, these are the wavering winds of nutrition. And I think that what we're starting to see in the 21st century is the real value in personalized nutrition. And I don't put my stake in the ground on any particular diet, because I do think that we're all so different. And what I do like to really subscribe to is the idea of the spectrum of healthy eating and what that looks like. So these are some of the principles. Again, it's not dietary dogma in the way of follow this or eat this and not that type of model, but more of a list of general principles that I think could be woven into several different dietary approaches. So starting from the top and working our way to the bottom, I'll go through these briefly. One is the top there, the purple, choosing clean, low toxin foods, ensuring sustainable sources, and opting for locally grown whenever possible. I think that this is really important in no matter what type of eating realm that we live in, making sure that we've got low toxic residue foods. I don't think it's really possible to have no toxins. Our environment is very polluted, but to minimize those toxins as much as we can. The next one, the indigo, is see and savor your foods. Eat the rainbow of colors in nature. So this is all about the idea of sight, seeing, savoring, and putting the colors together, seeing those colors, recognizing them. You're going to see as we move through that probably the loudest dietary principle I abide by is that of color. So we often rely on our eyes in order to assess the colors that we're eating. The next one is the blue-green, the turquoise color. And here's where we focus on the how of eating. Eating slowly, mindfully, chewing well, and really engaging all of our senses, not just the sense of vision, but now the sense of hearing, the sense of smell, the sense of taste, even the tactile sense of touch. So really to be sensory in our experience with food is, I believe, what helps us to feel more satisfied with the experience of eating. The next one is the color green. Practicing compassionate eating, being grateful, really being in that heart space of love and appreciation with our meals. Many people see food as a conduit of love. So how can we apply that conduit of love towards ourselves through self-love, through compassionate eating? That's really what this spectrum is focused on. And then yellow. Yellow is all about our power center. So being in sync with your body's needs, the power of the body. What is it telling us? How do we honor our hunger and be engaged with our gauge of hunger? That's so essential. For the orange, we've got choose quality oils and to have fun preparing foods, which is the antithesis of when we get caught up in emotional eating. And then finally, the red, eat a variety. People get into food ruts. And so how do we honor the body, listen and tune in to getting that variety, seeing the rainbow, and making sure that we're getting variety within each of the colors? So growing food, connecting to the earth and connecting to that which is grounding, like protein. So there you have it, the spectrum of healthy eating. And I talk about a lot of these principles in my book, The Rainbow Diet. The Rainbow Diet, this where I focus mainly on the nutritional principles that you see here. So indeed, we hear from Hippocrates that food is medicine. And what I would say is that color is also medicine. It's a different kind of medicine, but there's something about seeing the bright spectrum of colors. And when we put the two together, we would say and could say that colorful foods are surely the best medicine. Now, I mean, certain types of colorful foods, right? Because I'm not talking about the candies and the dyes, but I'm talking about the natural plant-based colors that we see already occurring in nature. Most of us, if you look at this picture, are used to the bland brown, yellow, and white foods, what I call the accelerated aging diet. So the question is, how do we find our vitality back? How do we get back into that rejuvenated sense of living? And this is why I am always talking about the rainbow. The rainbow is something I can talk with a 4-year-old about. I can talk with a 40-year-old. Can also talk with an 80-year-old about the rainbow. It's cross-generational, which tells me that it must carry some type of truth for the way we are as human beings and how we're programmed. And as I mentioned, I'm very selective about the type of rainbow that I'm advocating, really focusing in on natural, whole, plant-based foods. Now, just because I'm saying plant-based doesn't mean that I'm adhering to a vegan approach or a vegetarian approach. I think that all eating styles bring in, to some extent, plant foods. And so that's the unifier. That's what brings us together. Now, most people, when I tell them this, and they say, oh my goodness, you have a PhD in nutrition, you've done all this research, and what you're telling me is just to eat a lot of colors. I don't need you to tell me. I don't even need these studies to tell me to eat fruits and vegetables. I know that that's good for me. It's the one thing that you and I as health professionals wouldn't be able to arm wrestle. Well, then I would ask the question back, then why are you still not eating enough? Why is there still a gap? So there was a study done back in 2009 that basically showed that people were falling short on all of the colors. And mostly, as you can see by these percentages, purple and blue. 88% of people surveyed in this particular survey fell short in that color of food. And we're going to talk about the importance of each of these and why is it essential that we get enough blue purple? Why? Well, we'll get into that. It's intriguing. So just for a second right now, think about the colors that you had to eat today. You know, for most people, it's not even easy to think back to what they had for breakfast. For some of us, because we're in the health care profession, I would say that we're a little bit more vigilant, but sometimes we let ourselves get off track. So one simple exercise for you. What colors did you have to eat today? To reflect on that. You can even stop this recording and you can make a list, because I know sometimes it's hard to kind of create that mental list. And typically what I have clients do is, in a very non-judgmental way, to write down their foods that they ate. And I don't need to know the amounts. I don't even need to know the time. I just want to see the foods that they're taking in. And then I have a box of markers or crayons, And we do a very quick activity of just putting a line of color that corresponds to the color of that food right through that food. And pretty soon, the artistic palette of our palate reveals itself into the colors that we're eating. The beauty is that these colorful pigments that are in plant foods is that they're very protective. So many people worry about the toxins in the environment. They think about cancer. They think about cardiovascular disease. They think about Alzheimer's disease. All of these different manifestations of chronic disease and different environmental insults can be buffered against through the colors of plants. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, you're going to be convinced of what's available in the science and how to even explore and go further into that. There's quite a body of literature on supporting the idea of eating plant foods and helping to reduce chronic disease risk, whether it's cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, cataracts, or even any type of functionality, any kind of dysfunction. So it's pretty compelling. And again, we all eat plants, but we may not be eating the same plants. So it's not just that we can buffer ourselves from a lot of these chronic diseases through plants. We can also change our state of mind. This is a real intriguing part of nutrition that's starting to emerge in the mainstream medical literature now. This was coming from a journal in 2016 talking about how well-being and happiness increase with consumption of fruits and vegetables. And there's a lot that is coming out on the mood effects of food. And especially that the food is impacting our mood. And then our mood can then determine our food choices. So it's a beautiful dynamic going back and forth in a quick back and forth flux. This is not something that we have to wait days for. We can experience a change in mood after one meal. At least that's what the science tells us. So let us tour through the spectrum of research on colorful foods. This is where I'd like to get to each of the colors, dive in a little bit into that color, give you some examples of some foods within that color scheme, and let you know what the science says. This is a quick, I like making lots of teaching tools for clients. People need to see things in different ways. And one of the things that I've realized is that usually if people don't have a visual prompt, they readily forget. In other words, out of sight, out of mind. And so what I think is important, and I address this in my Rainbow Diet book, is to have a shopping list, is to have these actual foods listed out before us so that we can remember what an orange food would be. And also, why is orange important to eat? One of the things that I came to realize, and again, this is more through pattern recognition, this is more my science mind, is that each color was connected to a particular system and function in the body. So looking at red foods and the ability to reduce inflammation. Orange foods, reproductive function. Yellow foods, digestion. Green foods, looking at the cardiovascular system. Blue-green foods like sea plants being connected into our thyroid gland and our metabolism. Blue-purple foods being connected to the brain. And white foods, especially the foods that are healthy white, not white sugar, white flour, white salt, but the healthy white foods being connected to cleansing. So I like people to have these visual reminders of the particular foods and what they're good for so that they can stay on track. So let's start with the color red. When I talk about each of these colors, you're going to see that I have code names for each of the colors. And when I'm talking about the red color, I refer to this as the root. This is the earthy part of us. It's deep down in the body. It's everything structural. It gives us a sense of stability and safety and identity. So it's down to the DNA level. It's our blood. It's what's coursing through us that makes us who we are. So if you now translate the color red into properties of food and you say, okay, well, what gives us a sense of safety, a sense of stability, a sense that we are identifying with who we are? We can go the whole gamut from protein, which can be very stabilizing, minerals, which can fortify our physical structure. There are many other categories. If you look in the rainbow diet, you'll see those teased out. I talk about adaptogens, survival, the adrenal glands. I also talk about the immune system, identifying what is us versus not us, and how various nutritional components and red colored foods tie into that. And then which foods are anti-inflammatory? What quells the red color? And coincidentally, many of those foods tend to be red. And many of those foods also tend to be high in vitamin C and specific phytonutrients. So I'm setting the stage a little bit longer with this one so that you can see how I'm going to move through each color. That, yes, there are physical properties, but then there's also, I would say, perhaps more the actual energetic properties of those foods and how they support those different body systems. So red is a color. Think for yourself, what colors do you like? For some people, they really like the color red. Red's a passionate color. Red's a reactive color. Red can be associated with red-faced anger. It's something that causes us to somehow change our ability to react in the hopes of better surviving. So if you see a stop sign, curiously enough, it's red. And I've seen throughout my travels that it's red in many parts of the world. And if you didn't stop, there would be danger. You might crash into somebody. Your life might be threatened. So red is truly a color that evokes response. It's also the color of our red blood cells when exposed to oxygen. It is a life-giving force within us. It is the sense of ancestry. It's a sense of DNA and epigenetics. And when we're looking at red-colored foods, as I mentioned before, when we start to look at the color code of each one, we see that, and it's not in a tight box where we could say all red foods help with reducing inflammation. But for the most part, there is this cluster of red-colored foods that do seem to help. And not only do these red food phytonutrients help to reduce inflammation, they can also protect cells from damage. They can help the immune system, support the adrenal glands, fortify the bones, and build the blood. I mean, think of iron. Iron as just even in red meat. I know we're not talking about animal foods within this, just to make it more simple and basic, but many plant foods will correspond to these different properties, of course, because of their phytonutrients. And so here is a short list of some of those red-colored plant-based foods. We see on the far left, these are fruits. On the right, we have vegetables. So there are a number of these red-colored foods that are out there, and some of them are very replete, very dense with certain phytonutrients. This is not an exhaustive list. This is a basic list looking at lycopene, which is a carotenoid. It's typically what you find in tomato-based products, watermelon, pink grapefruit, guava. Helps with a number of different things. The beauty of phytonutrients is that they have these pleiotropic effects, meaning that they don't just do one thing. So in the case of a number of these, you're going to see that it does several things. It's not just limited to a box, but it may have certain tendencies to do certain things that align to certain functions. Anthocyanins, another one found primarily in things like berries, raspberries, strawberries, cherries, cranberries. and even some legumes like red beans or kidney beans. Astaxanthin is another carotenoid, and that tends to be found in more of the plant kingdom within the sea, which is then consumed by shellfish. So let's move on to more of the red foods high in vitamin C. As I mentioned before, there seems to be somewhat of a pattern here. This was taken from the USDA nutrient database when we did a search for foods high in vitamin C. And as you can see at the very top of the list, acerola cherry, rose hips. We move down to red peppers, tomatoes. This is just, cutting and pasting the top list. Not that we don't have other foods here, but there are a number of red foods that just tend to be high in vitamin C. Primarily acerola cherry, which is way at the top of the list. If we look at some of the red foods in their studies for whether or not they reduce inflammation, this particular study was looking at tomato juice consumption and that helping to reduce systemic inflammation in women who were overweight and or obese. And indeed, when subjects in this study had tomato juice, they had reduced inflammation. Strawberries, another red food. In this particular study, this is a different study in which they gave a strawberry drink before a meal, and then a reference group which had no strawberry. And what they found was that having the strawberries before a meal can help to attenuate any type of inflammation that would come about as a result of the meal. So, knowing what to couple at a meal setting, a single meal is so powerful in terms of the effects that it has. Beetroot juice is also an incredible food for reducing inflammation. In this particular study, they were looking at whether it was the juice or the cooked beet itself, which one would have a greater impact on blood pressure. It was a relatively small study. It was randomized. It was a crossover trial with 24 subjects with hypertension. Each one took each food for 2 weeks and then washed out for 2 weeks and switched. And what the researchers found was that there was more improvement in fats with the beet juice. So more improvement in lipids, but there was an equal improvement on blood pressure and inflammation. It didn't matter if it was the raw beet juice or the cooked beet. Both beet products were effective at reducing inflammation. Let's move on to the flow. Now, the flow is, as it suggests, it's different than the root. The root is about groundedness, stability, being anchored in our physical body. And once we can be anchored, we can move, we can flow, we can more readily let things in and let things out. So this is more of the water element. And when we think of food and properties of foods that will gauge our flow, here's where I talk about the energetics of fats and oils. Think of us as human beings. 50 to 80% of us at any given time, and usually we want it up in the higher percentage, is comprised of water, some type of fluid. And so for every cell in the body, we have this bilayer lipid membrane. It's primarily fats. And the composition of those fats and that membrane will determine what flows in, what flows out, and how things will signal through the cell. So most of our being is really controlled through the element of flow, through that dynamic flux that is provided by fats and oils. If we look at some of the other body systems here, it's also the reproductive health system. So for women, we're talking about the ovaries and the uterus. For men, we're talking about the testes, really the sites of producing that which is creative to the body. And we're also looking at the gut, moving things through the colon. The colon is responsible for making sure that we are concentrating the stool and resorbing any water and then letting go. Now, you're going to see that there's a beautiful compendium of science on orange-colored phytonutrients. I never thought much about orange-colored phytonutrients like carotenoids until I did my master's degree on carotenoids themselves. So I actually did a clinical trial. I did some research on these carotenoids, and these plant-based pigments are found ubiquitously throughout nature. And as it turns out, they serve a purpose. So when we talk about the flow, we are talking about the sense of creativity in the body. Here's where I talk a little bit more about the emotional, mental aspects. So when we're not being creative, when we're not being hydrated, when we're not flowing and having bowel movements on a daily basis, we get stagnant, we get stuck. And here's where I also put things like emotional eating, where we, instead of feeling and letting that feeling flow, we push it down with food in order to feel more comforted. So the liquid portion of the body, really being able to emotionally, mentally flow. This is the emotional part of us. So it's not always contained. Many people fear this part of themselves. And I do think that often what we could see is that much of the pathology of certain diseases involves some kind of emotional underpinning. There's something emotional at play. Even for me, with my ovaries and my uterus having many different issues over time, just having that sense of restriction and not really being able to be birthed into who I was until later in life, and really coming out in that creative, colorful way. So yes, the magnitude that we have as human beings in order to harness creativity for healing. What is healing? To me, it's actually recognizing the flow of the creative life force within us. And when that gets jammed up somewhere and stuck, this is when we experience a problem. So, of course, I could be talking with you about hydration and water, and I could even be talking about fish, orange-colored salmon, which live in the water. And, all of these things can be very relevant, and I do go into that a bit in my books. But again, for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to distill into orange-colored foods, which, when you look at the research, you start to see that there is a connection to fertility, to reproductive health. So what are some of those orange-colored foods? Well, again, I took these from the Rainbow Diet. On the far left, we have the fruits. On the far right, we've got some examples of the vegetables. And again, so important for clients to see these and to remember that there are certain things that come into season at certain times. So what are some examples of some orange food phytochemicals? Well, of course, the one we probably all think of immediately is beta-carotene, which makes carrots orange. And beta-carotene is a powerful carotenoid. It converts to vitamin A. It plays many different roles in the body. It's found in several foods, and it works together with other carotenoids. So even though I'm only talking about one carotenoid here, there are close to 700 of them. And it wouldn't be practical for me to be listing them all out for you. But there are some that are a bit more biologically active than others. Now, we've given lots of credence to beta-carotene because of its conversion to vitamin A, but there are other carotenoids that are not pro-vitamin A, but they have other functional roles in the body. For example, it's been found that there's something in the neighborhood of about 14 different carotenoids that have been identified in the ovaries, just in the ovaries. So these things tend to be fat soluble. So we tend to get improved absorption and integration and use in the body when we have these carotenoids coming in together with fats and oils. I also put in here bioflavonoids. When we're thinking of the citrus family, like oranges specifically, or tangerines, clementines, nectarines, papaya, I think of the bioflavonoids, which are also very powerful and protective and work very well with other nutrients like vitamin C. So when we go into the top carotenoid-containing foods through the USDA database, what we see are indeed a number of these orange-colored foods like carrots that are high on the list, and also mangoes and pumpkin. But keep in mind that even if you don't see orange on the surface of a plant, that it could be underneath the surface. In fact, we just did a blog on color density and looked at how you can get rainbow foods from even select foods that happen to be dense in more than one colorful pigment. So keep that in mind as we talk about each of these colors. What I tend to be referring to is the obvious visual color, but there can also be colors that hide underneath the surface of these foods as well. So oranges, one of the study on oranges that I'm thinking of is the work that came out, I believe it was in 2018. It was a study looking at women who ate certain fruits and vegetables and seeing a reduced risk of endometriosis. And in fact, the fruit that was most aligned to this reduced risk, I believe it was a 22% reduced risk, it was the consumption of oranges. So I think that that's profound, right? It's profound because oranges they're not just a vehicle for vitamin C. There are so many different things in oranges. And in this particular study on endometriosis risk, what the researchers had postulated was that it was the beta-cryptozanthin content of these oranges. And beta-cryptozanthin is one of those 700 carotenoids. Another great study on carotenoids and affecting the reproductive system, and some of you will really like this one. This was a study that was published in 2016. Over 1,000 premenopausal women followed for over 12 years, and they found that it was both beta-cryptozanthin, that carotenoid that I just mentioned, and fruit intake that was associated with a significant delay in the onset of natural menopause. That's right. Having certain fruits can help, at least as shown in this study, to delay the onset of menopause. And when you look at the amount that they had calculated, it was just about 400 micrograms of beta-cryptozanthin per day. And it's very reasonable to get that amount on a daily basis from orange-colored fruits like mandarins and oranges and peaches. And just having that set amount was shown to have the potential to delay ovarian senescence or ovarian decline by a little bit more than a year, which can be significant. We move on from the orange up into the fire of the digestive tract. Lots of fire in that center, and for some of us, we burn out our fire. We lose our stomach acid, our sense of rotting and ripening in that altar of the stomach. And we need to replete with stomach acid, something to keep us burning bright. So when we spoke about the root, I spoke about protein, minerals, but really went into red-colored foods. When I spoke about the flow, I did speak of fats, oils, water, liquids, but then also delved into orange-colored foods. Now this is the part of us that needs to burn energy. And we need to burn that energy. What fuels our metabolic cycles? What nutrients, which ones do we need in order to make sure that our metabolism burns bright? So here we have the macronutrients of carbohydrates. And this is why if you look at some people when they're really burnt out because their work-life balance is not in balance, what do they tend to go towards? They tend to go towards sugar. Sugar is a reward for many people, and it also helps to fuel us. It helps to give us back some of that energy that we've just lost, and it does it quickly. We can quickly burn that for energy, but is it the best energy all the time? Probably not. Would it be better to have long-chain sustainable carbohydrates to keep us in check and keep us sustained in our energy? I would say so. So here's where we focus on digestive support. And in the Rainbow Diet book, I get into supplements for that purpose. I talk about the mitochondria, which is one of the sites of how we burn different nutrients, right? We've got to fuel our inner chi through the mitochondrial matrix. And then what I'll speak about in this webinar specifically is some of the yellow-colored phytonutrients. Typically, I tend to put the yellow and the green together. They often coexist in nature, but I will try to just focus on some of the specific yellow foods and what they can do for us. You know, yellow is a happy color. We need to be, I think sometimes that people don't want to be healthy as much as they want to be happy. And they see their health as a conduit to get to that happiness. And so even a smiley face is typically yellow. You know, when we think of yellow, we think of the sun perhaps. We think of something that's radiant and warm and inviting and powerful. It is another sense of life force. It's what makes the plants go through photosynthesis and actually create those colors. There was a study in Manchester, England, that surveyed people on their color preferences and then assessed their mood state. And what they found was that people who were healthy in their mood and were not anxious and depressed tended to like the color yellow. People that were anxious and depressed tended not to pick the color yellow as their favorite color. Believe it or not, they actually showed them choosing colors like gray. Yeah, maybe it's easy to believe that. So the fire element can be wielded and harnessed to keep us burning bright, to keep us powerful, to keep us confident. It can also burn us out. And if I think of all of the different carbohydrates that people are eating, they're more or less burning themselves out. When I think of all the processed foods, the advanced glycation end products, as a result of heating these different foods, forming that Maillard reaction between protein and carbohydrate, getting that brownish color. It's almost like we've invited a little bit too much fire in our food that is now causing the fire of inflammation in our bodies. So let's talk just briefly about some of the yellow food science that's out there. And when I think of yellow foods, I'm thinking of which acidic foods, things like or maybe it's simply foods to help our digestive tract to work better, whether it's apple cider vinegar or ginger, or what about honey as a good, healthy sweetener choice? Maybe that gives us energy. So here are some yellow foods that I have on this list. And if you just look at it quickly, you're going to say, well, Deanna, why do you have kale and spinach here and greens? And that does get back to what I was saying before about how many times under the surface of green foods, you will find a number of these yellow compounds, things like lutein. So speaking of lutein and zeaxanthin are two carotenoids that often coexist in plant foods. And some of the highest lutein and zeaxanthin containing foods are things like the greens. So kale and spinach and leafy greens. Sometimes the obvious yellow is not always apparent. But for the foods that are obviously yellow, let's look at those a little bit. So if we're looking at naringenin is a phytochemical typically found in citrus fruit like grapefruit or also lemon. What we see is that naringenin has some very interesting anti-diabetic effects. And how does it have those effects? Well, it looks like it creates metabolic efficiency by changing some of the cell signaling patterns, like upregulating AMP kinase. AMP kinase is one of the kinases, one of the proteins within the cell that regulates metabolism and energy regulation. So there were a couple of studies here, as you can see in the slide. There was the other study listed at the bottom. Overectomized mice fed naringenin exhibited lower fasting glucose and insulin levels compared to controls. And they had a reduction of 50% in their adiposity. So there's a metabolic efficiency that can be created from certain phytochemicals that are found in citrus. I mentioned honey already. Honey is an intriguing yellow sweetener. And since we're focused on carbohydrates, I thought it was appropriate to talk about honey here because honey has many different properties, and there's a spectrum of different types of honey, of course. Some of them are a bit more refined, some of them are a bit more raw and sourced locally. And so if you look at some of the recent science, what you can see is that there is some nice science around its ability to protect from DNA damage. It can also be an anti-diabetic agent. When you look at some of the sweeteners compared to honey, honey seems to be medicinal over and beyond its sweetening effects. And again, that depends on the type of honey, how it's procured, how it's actually processed. So here is a paper two different papers actually, talking about how, just one specifically, talking about how honey is rich in a variety of different phytochemicals that tend to be antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory, they're antioxidant, cardioprotective, anti-cancer. And so there are many different varieties of honey, and as a result, many different varieties of different phytochemicals. This is why I always like to say, get a variety. Don't buy the same honey over and over again. Buy different kinds, buy different strains. Sometimes I'll buy a wildflower honey, and other times I'll buy just a local honey. Sometimes I'll do things like bee pollen. I'll use honey in bee-like products, propolis, and really getting into some of the really medicinal products from bees, which can serve us well in a number of capacities. When I'm thinking of carbohydrate and healthy yellow carbohydrate, I'm not thinking of bread and pasta. I'm thinking more in the way of lentils and legumes of various types. Now, legumes aren't for everybody, especially for those of us with burnt out digestive fires. But for those of us who are on the mend and have lots of fire within the gut to burn, these can provide a great fuel source of sustainable carbohydrate and also some prebiotic fibers that can slow down the release of sugar from foods into the bloodstream. Bananas. Bananas, yes, are a source of sweetener. They're also a source of prebiotic fiber. And believe it or not, there is some preliminary research on bananas being rich in serotonin. Actually, there aren't studies showing that people who eat bananas tend to be happier, but what we tend to see is that bananas inherently contain serotonin. So perhaps there can be another dot connected. It'd be nice to look at some research along those lines. Here's the article which goes into detail on bananas as being a source of serotonin. And what's interesting is that a lot of these yellow foods, plantain, pineapple, banana, are some of the highest in serotonin, just naturally occurring serotonin. Fascinating, right? And even if you take the banana itself and look at the peel, the pulp, and then looking at the pulp by taking a slice of it, the center or the edge, the center of the pulp, and that's the part that we eat, obviously, we don't eat the peel, at least I don't, is rich in serotonin. Yellow summer squash, a lot of these, again, these fibers, soluble fibers to slow the release of carbohydrate into the body. Saffron. Saffron is yellow, a deeply pigmented yellow that can help against metabolic syndrome. And pineapple juice. Pineapple juice is another one. You know, I could go on with all these different yellow foods and the different things that they do, getting into ginger and lemon. And pineapple juice is rich with different enzymes that help to break down things in the stomach, especially for people who need to move things through. So this was a study looking at drinking pineapple juice for 3 days before endoscopic balloon removal in order to help in dissolving food remnants in the stomach. Think about the people with gastroparesis or hypochlorhydria or achlorhydria. They're not producing any stomach acid. And maybe they've got some pancreatic insufficiency. But the yellow enzyme-rich pineapple can help us to replete that fiery, transformative power. Some of the warming spices, the fiery warming spices that you might hear about even in Ayurvedic medicine, for those of you who go across disciplines into traditional medicine, cinnamon, cardamom, saffron, ginger, shown to be helpful for reducing blood pressure in those with type 2 diabetes. Which, again, it's all related. Type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, we see it's not just about lipids, it's about blood pressure, it's about waist circumference. There's this profile that exhibits itself, and it seems as though some of these warming, yellowish, or even into the brown spices can help us to re-regulate our fire. And these are the kind of foods that we want to stay away from, the crunchy, crisp, fried, burnt out foods that we reach for when we're burnt out because of the advanced glycation end products, right? That just leads to more fire in the body. So even though I didn't talk about this with the other colors, I do think it's relevant for yellow, because when we have too much fire added to foods through their cooking method, this can lead to advanced glycation end products, which can lead to inflammation and ultimately aging in the body. So not so good to apply so much fire like frying, grilling, broiling, and roasting, and to favor things like steaming and poaching and stewing and boiling. All right. Here's just a short list. This was taken from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. I get the question all the time, well, Deanna, should I be eating raw foods? And the answer to that much depends on what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to liberate a lot of the fibers and even some of the fat-soluble carotenoids, the answer to that would be no, because we need some heat. We need a bit of steaming. The question is, how much heat do we need? A little bit of steaming can lead to liberation of some of the antioxidants in those foods. We can also lose if we're taking away the skin, or we're, not cooking it at all. If we have raw food, well, sure, we'll get some nutrients. We'll get some of the water-soluble phytonutrients, but we may not get the precious, the fat-soluble phytonutrients and other vitamins, and perhaps even some of the minerals that are bound up in the fibrous matrix. So yeah, a little bit of heat is good. Just like in life, we need a little bit of that adrenaline, a little bit of that spark, but we don't want to overdo it either, where we start to lose color, we start to lose our life force. And of course, I'm metaphorically speaking, but also practically speaking about losing the color of food. As we overcook it, it begins to lose its color, which is a sign that it's losing its phytonutrient density. All right, moving on to the green, the love, which is the cardiovascular system. And gosh, there's no shortage of green foods, is there? I almost feel that nature has intended that we have green foods. And green food is great for the expansion and the vasodilation within our body. So it's great because these green foods tend to be rich in nitrates, naturally occurring nitrates, which convert in the body to nitric oxide, which help to expand and open and widen the blood vessels so that the blood can flow better. When I think of nature and the calming effects that it has on us, I do think that it's not just the green foods that we're eating, it's actually being in the green, getting out there, doing some forest bathing, doing some earthing. Gosh, it's so important. Green is such a healing, harmonious color. And I feel like that really feeds our hearts. It really feeds us at a deep level. And so when I think of the heart, I also think of the lungs, and I think of the deep breath that we need to be taking in every moment, right? And really taking in that oxygen that we're getting from plants, from trees, and creating that symbiotic relationship. So as we take that deep breath in and we oxygenate, we can better fuel our body, because we need so much of breaking down food requires oxygen, aerobic respiration, and oxidative phosphorylation. And so it's essential that we bring in the essence of green and oxygen and widen our blood vessels with these green foods. So lots of green foods. This is a short list of some of the fruits and vegetables. And there are many different phytonutrients in green foods. Much like I was speaking to before, there are different colors that are underneath the green that we don't see outright, but they are there. They are medicinal and they are healing. But on the surface, we might be seeing just the chlorophyll, the actual substance that makes green foods green. But there are phytoestrogens that are in a number of green foods, phytosterols, phytomethylators. When I'm talking about phytomethylators, I'm talking about folate. I'm talking about B12. I'm talking cobalamin. I'm talking about the variety of B vitamins that are required for healthy methylation in the body. So here's a short list of the dietary sources of nitrates. So if we want nitrates, how do we get the rich sources of them? Because it's good for our blood vessels. Just think of all the people on high blood pressure medication. So looking at the very high sources of nitrates, we're looking at celery, cress, chervil, lettuce, red beetroot, spinach, and rocket. Some of the highest sources of nitrates in the whole realm of green, and a little bit of red there with the red beetroot. And don't forget about the greens of the beet, also rich in a number of these nitrates. I also think of green food powders. For people who don't feel like they can get enough green, green is really good at binding. And so that chlorophyll that we take in from green foods can bind toxins. When I teach on detox, I get into that in much more depth. But essentially, we look at all these different grasses and green powders and the power of them to protect us and to give us these potent antioxidants. I think of microgreens, I think of sprouts and all the derivations of all the leafy greens, and even coalescing a lot of that into something like a green smoothie, or even just the beauty of some of the green foods is that you can mask them into other food products without them being too apparent. Spinach is one of those things. Spinach is a relatively neutral food that you can slip into a smoothie very easily without most people realizing it. So green smoothie can help with, providing us with significant amounts of nitrates to calm the body. Chlorella, in the rainbow diet, I go much more into supplements. But if we think of chlorella, spirulina, some of these superfoods, why are they considered superfoods? Well, they're rather complete. They contain a wide array of many different healing components, not just one thing. We can't just say it's just about the chlorophyll. There's a number of very active agents within each of these superfoods. So this was a study looking at a chlorella supplement for 2 weeks to 6 women. It was double-blind, placebo-controlled. And what they found was that the chlorella helped to reduce levels of certain toxins like heterocyclic amines that we get even through cooking, which is why I always tell people, if you're going to have a hamburger, make sure you have something green together with it. Maybe it's an avocado that you have with it. There was a powerful study by Dr. Dave Heber at UCLA. It was an acute study in which they had one meal, and that meal was a hamburger. He assessed the inflammatory cytokines in the blood after eating, and he saw that there was an increase in IL-6 at 4 hours in the serum after the consumption of the hamburger. But when they came back to the lab and had a burger plus half of an avocado, there was no increase in IL-6. No change was observed. So, and they looked at other parameters within the study, like looking at the constriction of the blood vessels, looking at serum triglycerides. It's just amazing how we can eat smarter. We can eat smarter by coupling certain foods together and then blunting the potentially detrimental response. So green is healing. Green is, it's pervasive for a reason. We need green. We need greens. And so sulforaphane is one of those wonderful components that are lurking there in the greens. And I feel a little bit like I'm not giving homage to all the different compounds, but sulforaphane is a popular one these days because of its connection to multiple conditions. So if we think of the cruciferous vegetables, through the reaction of some of the glucoraphanins, which are inherently present together with the enzyme myrosinase, when these two come together, we can get even more active compounds. And that can be done even within the gut. In fact, the gut microflora, if we have a diverse array and a healthy gut microflora, it can help in the conversion of a lot of these phytochemicals to make them even more active. Green tea is another one. If I'm expanding that spectrum a bit, many healing effects of green tea, for sure. So that takes us to the truth. And in honor of the truth, I'm going to take a sip of my tea. When we think of the truth, we think of the mouth. We think of how we take food in. The mouth, the nose, the cheeks, the chin, the neck, the ears, it's the throat, and of course that precious thyroid gland that is overseeing our metabolism. So when I think of the thyroid, I think of the beauty of transformation, the beauty of being set free with our sense of authenticity. And, there really aren't a lot of blue-green foods, quite honestly. If you start to look at it, you'd have to really look carefully. And for the most part, what you find is a lot of green foods that are growing in the blue water. And some of those take on a deeper, richer hue, like a lot of the sea plants. Whether it's dulse or aramay or wakame, all the different ones that have these minerals that our thyroid needs for good function. So we can also be thinking of things like spirulina, which is another type of, I would call it a full spectrum superfood that gives us many different components, many different minerals as well. So usually when I talk about the truth, I talk about the truth of eating, our own personal truths, and knowing that how we eat is how we live is how we eat. So draw that as a correlate. If we're eating a lot of processed foods, chances are we're probably reflecting that we live a very processed life. We're moving quickly from one thing to the next. We're moving fast. We need things to be convenient. And so take a window into your eating to see what it's saying about your life. I never want to forget the how of eating, because the how of eating can be just as important as what we're eating. Now let me just go back here a second. Oops. Let's go back here. I want to just reflect on this for a second. So there's so many different forms of eating these days, whether we're overeating, undereating, emotionally eating, stressed eating, rushed eating, mindless eating. My goodness. Think about which word defines your eating style. And what does that say? There was a study back in 2008 which basically showed that children who had obesity or overweight issues tended to have a faster eating rate, more bites per minute than normal weight kids. And the interesting thing about the study, it's not reflected here in the slide, but the parents of the children set the tone because they had very similar eating rates to the children. So the kids that were overweight and obese that had a faster eating rate also had parents that ate very quickly. So it's amazing how our eating style can be imprinted societally. thyroid support, looking at nutrients, vitamins like vitamins A and D, looking at iodine, which can come from a lot of these sea plants, and balancing iodine with very important mineral, selenium. So again, I go into this deeper in the Rainbow Diet book, looking at the nutrients, the herbs, and then supplementally some strategies. We know that sea plants contain iodine, but you also have to be careful with a lot of these sea plants because they're so good at sequestering minerals, and because minerals have a very similar chemical structure to heavy metals, the sea plants can also bind heavy metals. So you have to be sure that you've got a good source of sea plants, seaweeds. So too much, too little can create issues here, depending on the thyroid condition at hand. Really important to work with a practitioner and to have clients work with practitioners on this because it can be often very complicated. Beta-carotene conversion to vitamin A, so back to what we were talking about in the orange flow, can be impaired by hypothyroidism. So people who are hypothyroid may actually need more of vitamin A, just straightforward, not the beta-carotene, but actually taking in vitamin A in its preformed state. Iodine is found in the soil, which means that it's going to be found in foods that are grown in the soil. And there are also supplemental forms because I tend to get concerned that our soils are becoming depleted. So really important to evaluate thyroid status and be looking at iodine levels in the body. Similarly, selenium. Selenium is one of those things. It's a double-edged sword, much like iodine, where we need an amount that's healthy for us, but not too much. Selenium is needed in order to convert inactive thyroid hormone to a more activated form. So it can be very important on many fronts. Licorice, I talk about, what helps the throat, what helps us with speaking and sore throats. And you can see how this ties very much into the root, which oversees the immune system. So licorice, looking at some of these agents which can clear the mucus, soothing the throat, coating the throat. Having licorice tea. It's one of my favorites, actually. Licorice is a little bit sweet in taste. It's very pleasant. And so it's just a nice way of making sure that our throat has the protection it needs. All right, in the interest of time, we've got 2 more colors. Shouldn't take that long, although I feel like I could have a whole hour just on the insight. The insight, what we're going to focus on here is mood, cognition, and blue-purple foods. And blue-purple foods, if you look at the science, it's very telling. What we tend to see is that there's a connection to brain health, brain function, cognition, and memory. Now, blue-purple foods are in short supply. It's not that that we can find them as readily as perhaps green foods. So you have to be very conscientious and make sure that when purple foods come into season, that you choose blue-purple. I have this mantra, which is whenever you can choose purple food, take it. Take it over any other colorful varieties, just because, again, we don't always get the choice for these beautiful indigo colored foods. But they are rich in a number of compounds, and typically I think of flavonoids, phenolics, I think of anthocyanins. There's a little bit of crossover sometimes with some of the other colors of food, like especially the red foods. But in general, pick purple because these purple foods are going to be dense in phytonutrients. So even in this particular report, they showed that purple carrots contained more than 2 times more alpha and beta carotenes than orange carrots. And orange carrots are good. They're a bit more starchy, more sweet than the purple carrots. Purple carrots tend to be more intensely flavored, tend to be thinner, and yet they are going to be more dense in nutrients. Purple grapes and grape juice. Don't forget about grapes. The grape skin is what you want. And there have been studies showing benefits of grapes on multiple fronts. In fact, the heart and the brain work together. So if you open up the vasculature, you're going to benefit circulation of blood up into the brain. So grapes help us with vasodilation, but also mood and memory. And so just for a second, just to look at this incredible diagram of all the different things that that grapes can do for us, how they're rich in many different things. We tend to think of resveratrol, but what about flavonoids? Flavonoids really help the brain with that sense of reducing anxiety. Here's that study I was referring to, purple grape juice helping to improve cognition and mood in healthy young adults. And, oftentimes when people's cognition is already maxed out in terms of it not being dysfunctional or impaired, it's hard to improve. But in this particular study, they showed that purple grape juice given to young, healthy adults helped them to improve their reaction time compared to not having the purple grape juice. So there are all kinds of postulations as to why that could be. But I think a little bit of juice can be really important because of these different agents. Resveratrol has been shown to be effective for multiple different mechanisms related to cognition and aging and brain health, and even for its role in the prevention of Alzheimer's disease. Berries of all types. Berries, especially blueberries, there is really a body of literature on having blueberries for the brain. There are so many different benefits of blueberries, much like even grapes. They tend to be neuroprotective. They stimulate neuronal growth. Blueberries, the blue of blueberries, the components that make them blue, the proanthocyanins, tend to localize in certain parts of the brain that are responsible for learning and memory. So here again, a short list of some of the phytonutrients that are in these precious blueberries. The smaller the blueberry, the better. Dr. James Joseph at Tufts University did a number of animal studies looking at how much berry do we need in our diet in order to help with cognitive tasks. And essentially what he found is that blueberry supplementation to animals at about 2% of their diet, which I can tell you in American standards is equivalent to about half a cup or about a scant handful, is if we can have that on a daily basis. I had my blueberries today already. I live in a part of the United States that grows a lot of blueberries. I have some land and we've got a number of blueberry bushes. So I always want to be sure that I am getting blue purple. Even if I have to choose purple potatoes, that will be the way that I can get some of these purple proanthocyanins. In fact, it's the purple potato that is it tends to be smaller than a yellow potato and also more medicinal. It has less glycemic impact and it's rich in a number of the proanthocyanins. Here's just a recipe from my Rainbow Diet book in which I put together green tea, berries, coconut milk, and a little bit of pomegranate juice. And you can have this even as a dessert. It's incredible. Here's another one of my recipes looking at, I make this all the time in various ways, just taking some berries and then putting a little bit of a crumble on top and heating it and like a cobbler, just having this warm berry, kind of a dessert, if you will. And then from a savory perspective, incorporating purple and these blue purple components into a salad through purple cabbage. So another great way to get these purple compounds. So we're going to close on the spirit. I know I've gone a bit over on this webinar. I hope that you've been patient with me. So with the spirit, we're focused on white. We're focused on cleansing, detoxification, the finer aspects of nutrition. So when I was growing up, I remember my mother's telling me, the whiter the bread, the quicker you're dead. And so I never really had this good feeling about white foods. However, there are a number of medicinal white foods, and even the white fleshy part of foods, like the white fleshy part of apples or pears, rich in quercetin as an example, or as you see here, onions, but not the white sugar, white salt, white flour. To be thinking broadly on other components like coconut, which has really been implemented societally, I think, whether through coconut oil or coconut butter, MCTs from coconut in order to help with more of a ketogenic approach. There's something medicinal and healing for us within the different coconut products for sure. Cauliflower can also be a healing agent of detoxification. Garlic, what a great purgative and antimicrobial, antiviral, antifungal, really purging the system of any kind of invaders with garlic. And so then I think of, it's not just the allicin that's in garlic, but gosh, there's so many different components that we can really glean and how they all work together. If we think of just the quality of these things, here's where, again, if we're talking about lowering toxins in food, making sure that we're choosing good quality coconut oil. So exiting out of the rainbow, let me just close on a couple of slides on the breadth of phytonutrients that we've been talking about. So first and foremost, how do you know if your body has adequate levels of phytonutrients? How do you know? Well, there are blood tests for that, direct and indirect tests. Sometimes what I'll do with folks is just do a rainbow food tracker, which you can do through my Whole Detox book. I have a quick little checklist for that you can do. And then how do you do this? How do you stage this in such a way that you're increasing the color proportion in your diet? So here are some tips. I call them the phyto tips. And after looking at everything that we've just reviewed, how do you get more color? Well, one thing is to shake it up. Try to get more variety, small amounts of many different things. As we can see, as attested to through nature and botanical diversity, is going to create more resilience in our body than just having large amounts of just a few things. So choosing variety. The studies on food diversity are compelling, whether it's for helping us with resilience in our immune system, our metabolism. It's so important to have variety. You might want to, I haven't talked about spices except for when we spoke about the fire and the digestive tract and heating that up with some cinnamon and saffron. But look at just this whole palette of color right here, just within the spice kingdom. So getting some more spices, some more colorful spices, this can add not only color, but healing and taste. It could help in savoring the experience of your food. I think smoothies are great. I'm noticing that throughout the world, these are quite popular these days. And even for my junk food dad, every now and then he can do a colorful smoothie and tolerate it quite well. Tea is another, especially in Europe, there are so many, in Asia, I think that, the culture of tea and how we can bring in more medicinals and more color through the agents of having tea, punctuating our days, slowing us down, getting us to go slower. And if it's not tea, having even phytonutrient infused waters to give us not just the sense of flow, but a little bit of color in there too. I also believe that it's important to look at how we're combining foods. So eating smarter along with eating more colorfully. So there's some nice science to suggest that combining certain foods can potentiate those phytonutrients for synergy. So putting green tea together with citrus flavonoids, putting turmeric together with black pepper, having garlic that we we crush it and we let it sit out and be exposed to oxygen. So different types of ways of preparing foods. We spoke a little bit about food prep when I spoke about the fire, by way of maximizing the benefit. And I would say most of all, find a colorful community. What I have seen and what the science would tell us is that your tribe determines what kind of colors you're taking in, what kinds of fruits and vegetables. And so if you can have a tribe that just gets it, they're colorful, they're eating colorful foods, then you're going to have a greater chance of really staying on that rainbow path. And if that doesn't work, what I would say is something that I saw in an Australian grocery store some years ago, the David Jones store. There was a sign above the produce section which said, "Don't eat vegetables because they're good for you. Eat them for one reason alone, because they're gorgeous." And that really circles us back to the fact of looking at colorful foods as art, as creativity. It's nature's creativity. So bringing that into our bodies helps us to be in a better state of well-being, and as the science would suggest, can even make us more colorful and creative. So don't forget to check into the Rainbow Diet book if you don't have it already. Again, it's not about a specific dietary pattern. It's more about guiding principles to help create some more color, variety, and creativity in our relationship with food. And if you remember nothing else from this lecture, what I would say is if you can take this away with you, this is the pot of gold. And it's eat the rainbow, be the rainbow. Really let those colors come forth within you by eating those foods that bring out the best in you. So please keep in touch. I've got a number of websites here. My DeannaMinich.com site is really my key site. I do certification programs. I do lots of courses of various types. So I would say thank you. Thank you for your patience. Thanks for being with me, going through this rainbow, through this spectrum journey. And please stay in touch. Be great to hear from you and to hear how you're doing with your rainbow path. Take care. Bye-bye.